Moscow. The Main Intelligence Directorate. The GRU. October 1986. The room smelled of stale coffee and ozone, the distinct metallic scent of overheating electronics. It was a windowless bunker buried deep beneath the grey, slush-covered streets of the Soviet capital, insulated from the world above, but intimately connected to the silent, deadly dance happening in the vacuum of space. Here, the hum of cooling fans was the only constant soundtrack to the end of the world. Colonel Viktor Volkov did not look at the man standing nervously beside his desk. His eyes were fixed on the lightbox in front of him, illuminated by the harsh white glow of fluorescent tubes. On the translucent sheet of film, a grain of silver halide represented a square mile of the American Midwest. It was a high-resolution image, snatched from the atmosphere by a Zenit spy satellite just hours ago, dumped via radio link to a receiving station in the Urals, and rushed to this desk. "Tell me again what I am looking at," Volkov said. His voice was quiet, lacking the thunder usually associated with officers of the strategic rocket forces. This was not a moment for anger. It was a moment for dread. The junior analyst, a young lieutenant with dark circles under his eyes, pointed a trembling finger at a cluster of pixels near the center of the image. "It is the Francis E. Warren Air Force Base, Comrade Colonel, Wyoming. We have tracked the silo construction for the new MX missiles there for 2 years. We know the coordinates. We have 3 SS-18 Satan heavy ICBMs targeted at this specific grid to ensure 99% kill probability." "I know the targeting package, Lieutenant," Volkov snapped, finally looking up. "I wrote it. What I am asking is why the thermal signature does not match the baseline." The lieutenant swallowed hard. "Because the silo is empty, sir." Volkov leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the silence. Empty. The Americans had spent billions of dollars developing the LGM-118 Peacekeeper, the most accurate, most destructive weapon in human history. A missile capable of carrying 10 independent warheads, each one able to vaporize a hardened Soviet command bunker. They had dug the holes, they had poured the concrete. The Kremlin had spent a fortune recalibrating the guidance systems of their own missiles to strike these silos before the Americans could launch. And now, the silos were empty. "Where are they?" Volkov asked. "We do not know," the lieutenant whispered. "The heat signatures appeared in the loading bay 3 days ago. Then there was a cloud cover event. When the Cosmos satellite passed over again this morning, the heat source was gone. Not launched, just moved." "Moved," Volkov repeated, testing the word. It tasted like ash. "One does not simply move a 195,000-pound intercontinental ballistic missile, Lieutenant. It is a skyscraper filled with solid rocket fuel. It requires gantries. It requires security perimeters. It requires a hole in the ground. Unless," the lieutenant hesitated, pulling a second photograph from his folder. This one was grainier, taken from a wider angle. It showed the vast spiderweb network of the Union Pacific rail lines stretching out from the base, disappearing into the endless horizon of the American plains. "Unless they did not put it in a hole, Comrade Colonel. Unless they put it on wheels." Volkov stared at the rail lines. Thousands of miles of steel track, millions of freight cars moving coal, grain, steel, and cattle across the North American continent 24 hours a day. A chaotic, noisy, unstoppable circulatory system of capitalism. If the Americans had figured out a way to hide a nuclear apocalypse inside a commercial train car, then the Soviet Union had already lost the war. Subscribe to Cold War Impact now to uncover the hidden history of the nuclear age and the secrets that nearly destroyed the world. The strategic nightmare facing the Soviet high command in the late 1980s was not just a matter of firepower, it was a matter of mathematics. For 40 years, the grim logic of nuclear deterrence relied on a simple equation. Location times yield equals destruction. If you knew where the enemy's guns were, you could point your own guns at them. It was a standoff, a Mexican standoff on a planetary scale, but it was stable because both sides could see the other. The United States Air Force, however, had just introduced a variable that made the equation unsolvable. Deep within the Pentagon, a radical idea had moved from the theoretical phase to the operational phase. It was a concept born of desperation. The Soviet SS-18 Satan missiles had become too accurate. They could drop a warhead within hundreds of feet of a US Minuteman silo, cracking the reinforced concrete like an eggshell. The Americans realized that their land-based missiles were sitting ducks. They were fixed targets on a map that had not changed in 20 years. To survive, the missiles had to move. But moving a nuclear weapon is a logistical nightmare. The early solutions were absurd. They considered putting missiles on massive, slow-moving trucks that would crawl through the Arizona desert. They considered digging miles of underground tunnels where missiles would shuttle back and forth like subway trains from hell. But these were too expensive, too slow, or too easy to track. Then, someone looked at the map of the United States and saw the answer. The US rail network. Back in Moscow, Colonel Volkov and his team were beginning to understand the magnitude of the deception. The intelligence coming in from field agents and electronic intercepts was fragmentary, but a terrifying picture was forming. The report from the embassy in Washington says the program is called Rail Garrison, the lieutenant said, reading from a decoded teletype. They are building special trains. From the outside, they look like standard boxcars, maybe slightly longer, but indistinguishable from the rolling stock used by Westinghouse or General Electric. But inside, they carry the LGM 118. Volkov walked to the massive wall map of North America. He traced the red lines of the rail networks. They went everywhere, through the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, across the scorching deserts of Nevada, through the cornfields of Nebraska, and into the industrial heartlands of Ohio and Pennsylvania. "Do you realize what this means?" Volkov asked, his voice low. "If they flush these trains out of the garrisons, if they scatter them onto the national network, they become invisible. We have spy satellites, Comrade Colonel," the lieutenant argued weakly. "We have the Rawsat radar ocean reconnaissance satellites. We have the Zenit optical birds. And what will they look for?" Volkov spun around. "A train? Which one?" "There are 30,000 locomotives in the United States. There are 1.5 million freight cars. Our satellites pass over a specific point for only a few minutes at a time. By the time the satellite returns for the next pass, the train has moved 60 miles. It could be on a siding, it could be in a tunnel, it could be hidden inside a warehouse in Chicago. It is a needle in a haystack, and the needle is moving at 50 miles per hour." The room fell silent again. The implications were catastrophic. The Soviet nuclear strategy was based on a counter-force strike, hitting the American military assets to prevent them from firing back. But you cannot hit what you cannot find. If the Americans put 50 peacekeeper missiles on trains, that meant 500 warheads enough to destroy every major city in the Soviet Union were roaming freely across the American countryside. The Soviet targeting computers required precise coordinates. Latitude, longitude, elevation. You typed them in, and the missile flew there. But how do you target a ghost? How do you tell an SS-18 to strike a train somewhere in Wyoming? You can't. "We need to find out how to distinguish them," Volkov ordered, pacing the small room. "There must be a tell, a flaw, a thermal bloom, a weight distribution issue, something that separates a nuclear missile train from a train carrying frozen chickens." He stopped at the light box again, staring at the empty silo. "The Americans are arrogant," Volkov muttered. "They love their technology. They believe they can engineer their way out of vulnerability. But every machine has a signature. Every engine makes a noise. Every heavy object deforms the earth beneath it." He looked at the lieutenant with steel in his eyes. "Get me everything we have on the Union Pacific rail standards. Get me the weight limits for their bridges. Get me the turning radius of their tracks. If these trains are carrying the Peacekeeper, they are heavy. Heavier than anything else on the rails. We will not look for the missile, Lieutenant. We will look for the damage it does to the tracks." This was the beginning of the Great Hunt. It was a game of cat and mouse, played not with submarines in the deep Atlantic, or with spies in the back alleys of Berlin, but with mathematics and physics across the vast, open spaces of the American West. The Soviets knew the weapon existed. They knew it was mobile, but they didn't know what it looked like, or how the Americans had managed to shrink a launch complex the size of a football stadium into the confines of a railroad car. The mystery was deep. The Americans claimed the train cars were indistinguishable from civilian traffic. They claimed the trains could launch from anywhere, a bridge, a curve, a straightaway. They claimed the reaction time was minutes. But Volkov knew that was impossible. To launch an ICBM, you need a stable platform. You need precise alignment with the center of the Earth. You need to account for the rotation of the planet. You cannot just fire a rocket from a wobbling train car. The physics didn't make sense. Unless the Americans had solved the physics. There is something else, the lieutenant said, hesitating again. A report from a source near the Street Louis Locomotive Works. He says he saw them testing a new engine, but it wasn't pulling anything. It was just sitting there, idling, for days. And the men working on it, they weren't wearing railroad coveralls. They were wearing Air Force flight suits. Volkov's eyes narrowed. Flight suits on a train? Yes, Comrade Colonel. And the security. It wasn't railroad police. It was Air Force security police. With dogs. They closed down a 2-mile section of track just to let this engine sit there. Volkov felt a chill. They were rehearsing. They were practicing the dispersal. The ghost train wasn't just a plan on paper anymore. It was hardware. It was steel and diesel. We are blind, Volkov whispered. We are staring at a map, and the targets are swimming away from us. He slammed his hand on the desk. I want eyes on the ground. I want to know what those cars look like. I want to know what is inside them. I want to know how they plan to stand a 90-ton missile upright on a moving train without tipping it over. Find out before they disappear into the noise forever. The Cold War had entered a new, terrifying phase. The static standoff of silos was over. The era of the mobile ghost had begun, and the Soviets were scrambling to catch up before the balance of power shifted permanently in favor of the United States. They needed to find the flaw in the American plan. Because if the peacekeeper rail garrison worked as advertised, the Soviet Union was defenseless. But as Volkov would soon discover, the Americans were hiding more than just missiles on those trains. They were hiding a technological secret that would baffle the best minds in the Kremlin, a mechanism so complex, yet so simple, that it defied the known laws of Soviet engineering. The investigation was just beginning, and the tracks led into the unknown. Moscow, the Steklov Institute of Mathematics. November 1987. The war was no longer being fought with soldiers. It was being fought with slide rules and stress tensors. Colonel Volkov stood in a lecture hall that smelled of chalk dust and cheap tobacco, watching 3 of the Soviet Union's most brilliant structural engineers argue over a blackboard covered in white equations. It is a question of moment arms, shouted Dr. Artyomov, slamming a piece of chalk against the slate. You cannot cheat gravity, Victor. The LGM-118 Peacekeeper weighs 195,000 pounds. That is nearly 90 metric tons. If you stand that missile upright on a standard railroad bogie, the center of gravity shifts. The moment the train enters a curve, the centrifugal force will tip the car. It will derail. The Americans will nuke their own cornfields. Volkov watched the argument impassively. He wasn't interested in why it couldn't work. He needed to know how they made it work. Unless they strengthen the tracks, suggested a younger engineer, they would need to pour concrete foundations under the rails. We would see that construction from space. They aren't pouring concrete, Volkov interrupted, his voice cutting through the academic noise. Our satellite passes over the Union Pacific main lines, show normal maintenance crews. They are replacing wooden ties with wooden ties. They are using standard gravel ballast. There is no reinforcement. The rail network is civilian. He walked to the blackboard and erased a complex equation about wind shear. In its place, he drew a simple rectangle. This is the mystery, Volkov said. The Americans claim they can park this train anywhere. A siding in a small town, a bridge over a river. And from that unstable, wobbling platform, they intend to launch the most sophisticated machine ever built. How? The Soviet engineers fell silent. They knew the difficulties because they were struggling with the same problem. The Soviet equivalent, the SS-24 Scalpel train, was a behemoth. It was heavy, clumsy, and required specific sections of reinforced track to fire. It was a brute force solution, but the American rail garrison train looked delicate. Volkov projected a new slide onto the wall. It was a grainy photograph taken by a KGB asset driving a sedan alongside a rail yard in Pueblo, Colorado. It showed a train car. It was painted a dull industrial silver with the logo of Westinghouse on the side. It looked like it was carrying turbine parts or heavy transformers. Look at the wheels, Volkov commanded. Count the axles. 4 axles, Artyomov muttered, squinting. Standard freight configuration. That is impossible. To distribute the weight of a peacekeeper missile, you would need at least 8 axles, maybe 12. With 4 axles, the point load on the rails would shatter the steel. The train would grind to a halt. Exactly, Volkov said softly. By all the laws of engineering, this train should not exist. And yet, it moves. It travels at 50 miles per hour. It blends in with the grain hoppers and the coal cars, which means the Americans have found a way to cheat the weight. This was the second layer of the mystery. The first was the location, the needle in the haystack. The second was the camouflage itself. If the missile car looked different, if it had more wheels, a strange shape, or visible hydraulics, the Soviet image analysts could write an algorithm to find it. They could tell the computers, look for the train car with 12 axles. But the Americans had anticipated this. They had seemingly engineered a heavy ICBM to ride on a light chassis. It was a magic trick. Perhaps the missile is not inside, the young engineer ventured. Perhaps it is a decoy program. We thought that, Volkov admitted. But we have intercepted telemetry. They are running drill alerts. The crews rush to the trains. The engines spool up. The electronic chatter indicates a live weapon system. It is real. The investigation shifted from the macro to the micro. Volkov's team at the GRU began dissecting the American rail industry. They studied the suspension systems of American freight cars. They stole manuals from General Motors' electromotive division. They were looking for the tell, the subtle deformation that would give the game away. In a secure viewing room back at the Ministry of Defense, Volkov sat with a new specialist, a woman named Elena who specialized in thermal imaging. "We have been looking at the wrong thing," Elena said, adjusting the contrast on a monitor. "We have been looking for the missile. We should be looking for the people." On the screen was a recording of a train moving through Nebraska. A standard American freight train has a crew of 2 or 3, Elena explained. An engineer, a conductor, maybe a brakeman. They sit in the locomotive. The rest of the train is cold steel, dead cargo. She pointed to the middle of the rail garrison train. "But look at this car. It is supposed to be a boxcar. But look at the heat signature." Volkov leaned in. There were faint, rhythmic pulses of heat emanating from the roof vents. Not the heat of machinery, but the heat of life support. Air conditioning, heating, people, Volkov whispered. "Launch crews," Elena confirmed. "The Americans have put the launch control center inside a train car. It looks like a freight car from the outside, but inside, it must be like the capsule of a Minuteman's silo. Bunks, consoles, oxygen scrubbers, food storage. They are living inside the train, which means, Volkov reasoned, that the train is heavy even when the missile is not fueled. The armor plating to protect the crew from small arms fire, the lead shielding to protect them from radiation. It adds tons of weight. And yet, Elena tapped the screen, look at the suspension springs. They are not compressed. The car is riding high. Volkov felt a headache forming behind his eyes. It didn't make sense. The car was full of heavy equipment and men, yet it rode on the tracks as if it were carrying pillows. The Americans were manipulating the visual signature. They had likely installed stiffer springs or hidden hydraulics to make the heavy cars look light to a casual observer or a spy satellite measuring the shadow of the wheel gap. "They are mocking us," Volkov said. "They have designed a train specifically to defeat our analysis." The frustration in the Kremlin was mounting. The General Secretary was demanding answers. The arms reduction talks were stalling because the Soviets couldn't verify the number of these missiles. If you can't count them, you can't sign a treaty. And if you can't target them, you can't deter them. Then came the report from the defector. He wasn't a high-level scientist, just a maintenance worker who had defected from West Germany, but he had family in the American rail sector. His debriefing in a safe house outside East Berlin provided the first crack in the mystery. He talks about the reaction, the GRU interrogator told Volkov over a secure line. What reaction? The launch reaction. The Americans know the train cannot support the launch. If they fire the main stage engine while the missile is inside the tube, the exhaust will melt the floor of the train car, melt the wheels, and melt the tracks. The train will become a puddle of molten steel. So they must use a cold launch, Volkov said. Compressed gas to pop the missile out, like a submarine. Yes, the interrogator said, but that creates a different problem. Recoil, Newton's third law. To throw a 90-ton object into the air, you must push down with 90 tons of force. A train car sits on springs. If you push down that hard, the springs will bottom out, the car will bounce, and the missile will tip over and explode on the ground. Volkov visualized the disaster. A nuclear warhead tumbling off a bouncing train car. So how do they stop the bounce? Volkov asked. The defector says they don't use the wheels, the interrogator said. He heard rumors of the spider. The spider? A mechanism. Something that comes out of the belly of the train. But we have never seen it. The train cars look smooth underneath. Volkov hung up the phone. A mechanism hidden in the belly. That was the key. The Americans had hidden the launch pad inside the train. He ordered his team to re-examine the side view photographs of the Westinghouse cars. They zoomed in until the grain of the film dissolved into noise. They looked at the undercarriage, the dark, shadowy space between the wheels. There, Volkov pointed, between the bogies. That box. It is too big to be a brake cylinder. It is too low to be a water tank. It looks like nothing, sir, the lieutenant said. Just a shadow. It is only a shadow because they painted it black, Volkov said. That is the spider. That is how they cheat the physics. But knowing it existed was not enough. Volkov needed to know how fast it deployed. If the train had to stop, and the crew had to spend an hour setting up jacks and stabilizers, then the Soviet satellites had a chance. They could catch the train while it was vulnerable. We need a timing test, Volkov decided. We need to know how long it takes for a moving train to become a firing battery. Is it an hour? 10 minutes? Or, he feared the answer was seconds. The intelligence gap was closing, but the danger was increasing. The Soviets realized that the rail garrison was not just a train, it was a transformer. It was a mobile fortress that could reconfigure itself. But there was still one flaw the Americans couldn't hide. The sheer length of the train. To carry 2 missiles, a launch center, a security car, and the locomotives, the train had to be a specific length. Filter the satellite data, Volkov ordered. Ignore the single cars, ignore the short hauls. Look for any train configuration that matches this specific length. 2 locomotives, 5 cars. No more, no less. Scan the entire United States rail grid. It was a desperate move. It would generate thousands of false positives. Every grain train, every coal train that happened to be short that day would trigger an alarm. But Volkov was running out of options. As the computer banks in the basement began to hum, processing terabytes of visual data, Volkov stared at the map of the American Midwest. The red lines of the rails looked like arteries. And somewhere in that bloodstream, the virus was hiding. The mystery was about to deepen. The computers would find a match. But the match wouldn't be in the middle of a desert or a cornfield. The match would be somewhere that made Volkov's blood run cold, a place where a nuclear missile had absolutely no business being. "Comrade Colonel," the radar operator called out, his voice trembling. "We have a hit, but the location, it makes no sense." Volkov walked to the screen. He looked at the coordinates. He looked at the map overlay. The train wasn't in a military zone, it wasn't in the wilderness. "Is that?" Volkov squinted. "Yes, sir," the operator said. "The train is parked in the middle of downtown St. Louis, 50 meters from a baseball stadium. The Americans were hiding their doomsday weapons, not just in the open, but in the crowds. They were using their own population as human shields. And that changed everything." The Ural Mountains, Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces Command Center, March 1988. The mood in the bunker had shifted from confusion to a cold, sweating panic. The St. Louis incident, as it was now called in the classified dossiers, had proven Volkov's worst fear. The Americans were using the chaotic noise of their own civilization as a shield. "It is a hostage situation," General Zaitsev growled, staring at the map where the red dot of the train had been lost in the tangle of the Missouri rail yards. "If we strike that train in the city, we kill 200,000 civilians. The Americans know we will not fire first under those conditions. The train is immune as long as it is near a population center. But it cannot stay in the city forever," Volkov countered. "To be effective, it must disperse. It must go into the wilderness, where it can align its guidance systems away from magnetic interference. And when it leaves the city, we will be waiting." But Volkov was wrong. They were waiting, but they were blind. The train left St. Louis under the cover of a thunderstorm. The thick cloud layers blocked the optical satellites. The heavy rain scattered the radar returns of the Rorschach birds. For 6 hours, the Soviet Union lost contact with a weapon capable of ending their nation. When the clouds broke over the plains of Kansas, the analysts scrambled to find the train again. They scanned the tracks, they checked the sidings. "We have it," a young operator shouted. "Heading west on the Union Pacific Main Line, passing mile marker 400. 2 locomotives, 5 cars. It matches the profile." Volkov breathed a sigh of relief. "Targeting solution?" "Locked," the operator said. "We can have an SS-18 on that coordinate in 26 minutes. "Wait," Volkov said. He walked to the screen. He magnified the image. The train looked right. The length was right. The color was right. But something nagged at him. "Zoom in on the second locomotive," Volkov ordered. The image blurred, then sharpened. The locomotive was a standard Electromotive Division GP-42, the workhorse of American freight. But on the side, just below the cab window, there was a number stenciled in white paint. "Up 4,921. Volkov pulled a thick binder from a shelf, the Jane's World Railways registry. He flipped the pages frantically. "Up 4921, he muttered. "Here, Union Pacific Manifest. Assigned to Topeka hauling grain from Topeka to Denver." "So? They commandeered a grain engine?" General Zaitsev shrugged. "No," Volkov said, his voice dropping. "Look at the cars behind it. They are not the Westinghouse silver cars. They are rusty. They are dirty. Camouflage," Zaitsev argued. "Or," Volkov whispered, "it is just a grain train." "But the computer matched the length. The Americans have thousands of trains," Volkov said, slamming the book shut. "Statistically, hundreds of them will be exactly the same length as the missile train. They look the same from space. They travel on the same tracks. They use the same engines." Volkov realized the brilliance of the American strategy. It wasn't just about hiding, it was about mimicry. The Peacekeeper rail garrison trains were designed to be unremarkable. They didn't look like military vehicles. They looked like the boredom of everyday commerce. To find the missile train, the Soviets would have to track every train in America. It was a data processing impossibility. It was a shell game played on a continental scale. But then, the twist arrived. A teletype machine in the corner began to chatter, spitting out a high-priority message from a deep cover asset in Utah. The message was short, encoded in a burst transmission to avoid triangulation. Subject: Ghost Garrison. Eyewitness confirmation. Location: Desert Test Track, Utah. Event: Deployment Test. "Read it," Volkov commanded. The communications officer's hands shook as he held the paper. The asset was hiking near the restricted zone. He saw the train stop. He says the roof didn't just open. "What happened?" "He says the roof exploded." Volkov froze. "Exploded?" "Not a detonation, a mechanical separation. The roof panels of the boxcar were jettisoned, blown off by pyrotechnic bolts, and then the missile rose." "How?" Volkov demanded. "We calculated the weight. The car should have tipped." "The spider," the officer said. "The asset saw it. As the roof blew off, hydraulic rams shot out from the bottom of the car. They didn't just touch the ground. They dug into the gravel ballast. They lifted the entire 90-ton train car off its wheels." Volkov closed his eyes. He could see it. The engineers had solved the suspension problem by ignoring it. They turned the train car into a temporary building. By lifting the wheels off the track, they bypassed the springs. The train became a solid launch pad, anchored directly to the earth. "And the launch?" Volkov asked. "Cold launch," the officer read. "A gas generator fired. The missile was ejected 50 feet into the air before the main engine ignited. The train car was engulfed in steam, but it did not melt. The train survived." The room fell silent. The weapon was operational. The physics worked. The impossible was real. But the teletype wasn't finished. There was one more line. Note: Asset observed second train 1 mile behind. Identical configuration. But when first train erected missile, second train did not stop. It continued past. "A second train?" Zaitsev asked. "A support unit?" "No," Volkov realized, a cold realization washing over him. "A decoy? Decoys? Do you not see?" Volkov pointed at the map of America. "If they can build one train that looks like a freight hauler, they can build 10 or 50. But they only need to put missiles in some of them." This was the true horror of the rail garrison. The cost of a real missile was $100 million. The cost of a train car painted to look like it held a missile was a fraction of that. The Americans could flood the rail network with ghost trains, empty boxes, trains that went nowhere, did nothing, but forced the Soviet Union to target them with precious warheads. "We have to target them all," Zaitsev whispered. "Every train that matches the profile. We would run out of missiles before we destroyed 10% of their rail network." "We are bankrupting ourselves chasing shadows," Volkov said. The strategic balance had not just shifted, it had shattered. The Soviet economy was already groaning under the weight of the arms race. They could not afford to build 1,000 more SS-18 Satans just to shoot at empty boxcars in Nebraska. And then, the phone on Volkov's desk rang. It was the red phone, the secure line from the Kremlin. Volkov picked it up. He listened for a moment. His face went pale. "Yes, Comrade General Secretary. I understand." He hung up. He looked at his team. "The Americans are escalating," Volkov said. "They are not just keeping these trains in garrisons anymore. We have reports that the trains are beginning to move out, permanently." "War?" the lieutenant asked. "No," Volkov said. "Politics. The American president is using the trains as a bargaining chip. He is putting them on the rails to show us he can. He is daring us to blink." But as Volkov looked back at the satellite image of the grain train in Kansas, he noticed one final detail that had escaped everyone else. A detail that turned the mystery into a crisis. On the civilian grain train, on the third car back, there was a small, almost invisible antenna array on the roof. It was painted to look like a vent. But it was a UHF receiver. "That is not a grain train," Volkov said, his voice barely audible. "That is a command train." "Command?" "It is not carrying a missile," Volkov realized. "It is carrying the codes. They have decentralized the launch authority. They don't need the White House to launch anymore. If Washington is destroyed, these trains can decide to fire on their own." The mystery of where is the missile was solved. It was everywhere. But the new mystery was far more terrifying. Who is in control? If the trains could launch autonomously, then the logic of deterrence, the red phone, the hotline, the diplomacy was dead. The fate of the world was now in the hands of a few dozen men riding in a boxcar through the middle of nowhere, undetectable, unreachable, and unstoppable. And Volkov knew, with sinking certainty, that there was no technology in the Soviet arsenal that could stop a ghost that could think for itself. Washington, D.C., Moscow, the final days of the Cold War, 1989 to 1991. The ultimate secret of the peacekeeper rail garrison was not the train. It was not the hydraulic spider that lifted the car, nor the command train that decentralized authority. The true shock, the technological marvel that terrified Colonel Volkov and the Soviet High Command more than anything else, was a basketball-sized sphere of beryllium floating in a bath of fluorocarbon fluid. For years, the Soviet analysts had clung to one final hope: accuracy. They believed that even if the Americans could hide the missile, they couldn't aim it. To hit a hardened Soviet silo 6,000 miles away, an ICBM needs to know its starting point to within a fraction of an inch. In a fixed silo, this is easy. Surveyors measure the location once, and it never changes. But on a moving train, a train that vibrates, stops on curved tracks, or parks on uneven gravel in a blizzard, the math is impossible, the Soviet ballistic experts had insisted. If the train is off by 1 degree in alignment, the warhead misses Moscow by 3 miles. The rail garrison is a bluff. It is a scattergun, not a sniper rifle. They were wrong. And in the winter of 1989, they finally discovered why. Intelligence reports reached Volkov's desk, detailing a component known as the AIRS, the Advanced Inertial Reference Sphere. It was the brain of the LGM-118 Peacekeeper, and it was arguably the most complex mechanical device ever mass-produced by human hands. Unlike previous guidance systems that used gimbals and bearings, which would wear out or jam under the vibration of a railroad track, the AIRS had no mechanical connection to the missile frame. It was a sphere floating inside another sphere, suspended in a thick, neutral buoyancy fluid. It was completely isolated from the shaking of the train. When the train stopped to launch, the missile didn't need to ask a satellite where it was. It didn't need to align with the stars. The AIRS had felt every turn, every acceleration, and every braking maneuver the train had made since it left the garrison. It had a perfect, unshakable memory of its motion. It knew exactly where it was on the surface of the Earth, down to the meter, purely by feeling the movement. It is a perfect machine, Volkov realized, reading the stolen technical schematics. We are relying on the train, shaking the guidance system loose. But the guidance system is floating. It does not feel the train. It only feels the truth. This was the checkmate. The Americans had built a sniper rifle that could ride a roller coaster. The Soviet strategy of hardening their silos was now obsolete. The Peacekeeper, launched from a moving train in Wyoming, could drop 10 warheads on 10 different Soviet silos with enough precision to destroy them all. The Soviet Union was now defenseless. The economic death spiral. But the true shock of the rail garrison program wasn't nuclear, it was economic. As 1990 dawned, the Soviet Union was crumbling. The shelves in Moscow were empty, the oil prices had plummeted. And yet, the Kremlin was being forced to spend billions of rubles it didn't have to counter the ghost train. Volkov sat in a budget meeting that felt more like a funeral. The generals were demanding a new fleet of railway mobile missiles, the SS-24 Scalpel, to match the American threat. They wanted to build thousands of miles of secret tunnels. They wanted a constellation of new radar satellites designed solely to track trains. "We cannot afford bread," the finance minister whispered, his head in his hands. "And you want to build a railroad to nowhere? If we do not," a general shouted, slamming his fist on the table, "the Americans will hold a gun to our heads. The rail garrison allows them to strike first and survive our retaliation. It breaks the deadlock of mutually assured destruction." Volkov watched the argument and realized the grim truth. The Peacekeeper rail garrison didn't need to fire a single shot to destroy the Soviet Union. It was doing it right now, in this room. The sheer threat of the weapon was forcing the Soviet leadership to bankrupt the country in a desperate attempt to catch up. The Americans had lured them into a technology trap. The US economy, buoyant and computerized, could absorb the cost of the rail garrison. The Soviet economy, rigid and rusting, could not. "It is a siege," Volkov said quietly, interrupting the shouting match. "They are not besieging our cities, they are besieging our treasury. Every dollar they spend on a train forces us to spend 10 rubles on a defense. We are not losing the arms race, comrades. We are losing the bank account." The irony of victory. Then, the final twist occurred. The one thing neither Volkov nor the American engineers expected. The Cold War ended. It didn't end with a bang. It didn't end with the roof of a boxcar blowing off in the Utah desert. It ended with people standing on the Berlin Wall with hammers. It ended with the Soviet flag coming down over the Kremlin on December 25, 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed under its own weight, exhausted by the decades of paranoia and the crushing cost of trying to track American ghosts. In the United States, the victory was bittersweet for the engineers of the rail garrison. The system was fully tested. The trains were ready. The missiles were lethal. The air spheres were humming in their fluid baths, ready to guide the apocalypse. But with the Soviet threat gone, the justification for the weapon vanished. President George H.W. Bush looked at the budget. He looked at the New World Order, and he made a decision that shocked the military-industrial complex as much as the weapon had shocked the Soviets. He cancelled the program. The Peacekeeper missiles were removed from the trains. The specialized rail cars, built with millions of dollars of secret technology, were shunted onto sidings. The spiders were retracted for the last time. The locomotives were returned to the fleet or scrapped. Colonel Volkov, now a retired citizen of the new Russian Federation, watched the news from his small apartment in Moscow. He saw the reports of the American stand-down. He laughed. A dry, humorless laugh. "They built the perfect weapon," he told his reflection in the mirror. "And they never used it. They terrified us to death, and then they just parked the train." The legacy of the ghost. The Peacekeeper rail garrison remains one of the most fascinating what-ifs of military history. It was a weapon system that solved the unsolvable problems of nuclear warfare. It made the static silo obsolete. It turned the entire North American continent into a launch pad. For a brief window in time, the most dangerous object on Earth was not a submarine lurking in the Atlantic or a bomber circling the Arctic. It was a nondescript train car, rumbling through a small town in Nebraska, passing, flashing, crossing signals where children waved at the engineer, completely unaware that the end of the world was rolling by just a few feet away. The infrastructure is largely gone now. The cars are museum pieces or scrap. The missiles were repurposed for space launches or dismantled. But the lesson of the rail garrison remains. It proved that in the game of global dominance, the most powerful weapon isn't always the one that explodes. Sometimes, it's the one that forces your enemy to chase a shadow until they collapse from exhaustion. The KGB satellites never found the trains, because in the end, there was nothing to find. The trains were just a delivery system for fear, and in that, they were perfectly accurate. The tracks are still there, crossing the vast American silence. And sometimes, late at night, when a heavy freight train rumbles through the darkness of the Midwest, the ground shakes just a little differently, a reminder of the time when the apocalypse rode the rails.